When Beckett's words surface in BMX culture, try again, fail better, they do so almost accidentally, as if smuggled in through knee pads and scar tissue rather than philosophy books. Yet the fit is uncannily precise because Beckett is not a theorist of success deferred, but of action stripped of guarantees. That is exactly the condition under which BMX operates. Beckett's writing is saturated with failure, but not failure as a problem to be solved. His characters fail to speak, fail to move, fail to remember, fail to finish. Crucially, they also fail to stop. This is the paradox that matters. In works such as Worst Word Ho or The Unnameable, action continues not because success is possible, but because cessation is impossible. I can't go on, I'll go on is not a heroic declaration, it is an ontological bind. One continues because one is already entangled in continuation. BMX shares something of this bind. A rider attempting a new trick does not persist because they are confident of landing it, nor because they believe effort guarantees reward. They persist because they have already committed. The body has entered a question that cannot be resolved abstractly. Once the first attempt is made, withdrawal becomes its own kind of failure. Beckett's insight is that failure is not the negation of action, but its most stable condition. BMX makes this visible in bodily terms. Beckett is often described as a minimalist writer, but this description risks missing the intensity of his attention. His prose is stripped down not to achieve elegance but to remove illusions. What remains is process, halting, repetitive, recursive. Events do not progress as much as circle, stutter and fray. Similarly, in BMX, creative progress rarely follows a clean arc. Attempts repeat with minor variations. The rider seems to be doing the same thing again and again, yet something is slowly shifting beneath the surface. Beckett's work trains us to recognise this kind of movement, in which change does not announce itself as novelty, but as alteration within sameness. Failure for Beckett is not merely empirical, it is structural. Language fails to capture experience, intention fails to align with outcomes, memory fails to stabilise identity. Importantly, Beckett does not propose overcoming these failures, he proposes inhabiting them. This is a crucial philosophical move. To inhabit failure is not to resign oneself to incompetence, but to refuse the fantasy of mastery. In BMX, this refusal is enacted physically. No matter how skilled a rider becomes, the bike never disappears into transparency. Gravity does not soften with experience. Each new problem reintroduces the possibility of falling. Mastery does not abolish failure, it only refines one's relationship to it. When Beckett writes of failing better, he is not suggesting improvement in the usual sense. He is pointing towards a more precise failure, a failure that sheds excess hope, excess force, excess illusion. To fail better is to fail with less noise. In BMX, this is evident when a rider stops fighting a trick and begins listening to it. Early failures are often loud, over-rotation, panic, stiffness, bails that scatter the body away from the bike. As attempts accumulate, failure becomes quieter. The bike stays closer, the movement nearly coheres. The difference between failure and success narrows until it becomes almost imperceptible. This narrowing is where creative emergence occurs. Beckett's late prose is famous for operating at a threshold of articulation where meaning almost collapses but does not quite disappear. BMX has its own threshold states, moments when a trick is neither failed nor landed but hovers between the two. These moments are phenomenologically rich. The rider feels that something is there, just out of reach. Beckett would recognise this sensation. His characters are constantly on the verge of saying, remembering or finishing something. The verge is where meaning resides. Risk in this context is not a dramatic leap into danger but a sustained exposure to the unresolved. Beckett's characters risk nothing in the conventional sense. They are often immobilised, impoverished or already ruined. Yet they risk something subtler, the risk of continuing without justification. BMX mirrors this when a rider continues to attempt a trick long after rational calculation would suggest stopping. The risk is not only a physical injury but psychic erosion, frustration, doubt, the slow question of one's own capacities. To continue anyway is not optimism, it is fidelity to the process itself. Beckett's work is often accused of nihilism, but this misunderstands his ethic. There is no promise of meaning, but there is a commitment to attention. He does not ask whether action will succeed, he asks whether one can remain with action as such. BMX embodies this ethic through repetition. The rider returns to the same obstacle, the same approach, the same movement, not because it guarantees progress, but because the act of returning to itself is meaningful. Creativity emerges not as a breakthrough, but as an accretion of minute differences. One of Beckett's most unsettling insights is that failure is not something that happens occasionally. It is what is happening all the time. Success, when it occurs, is momentary and unstable. This resonates strongly within BMX, where even landed tricks do not resolve uncertainty. A trick landed once may never be landed again. Consistency is provisional, conditions change, bodies age, confidence fluctuates. There is no final state in which failure has been conquered. This absence of finality reframes creativity. Rather than being oriented towards completion, creativity becomes a mode of persistence. Beckett's characters persist not because they believe in progress, but because stopping would be dishonest. Similarly, BMX riders often speak of a sense that riding is not optional, not in the sense of addiction, but in the sense of coherence. To ride is to align with oneself. Failure does not threaten this alignment, it confirms it. Beckett also complicates the notion of agency. His characters are rarely in control of their actions. They act because something acts through them. BMX riders frequently describe moments where the body seems to know before the mind does, where commitment happens before conscious decision. Failure here is not always attributable to error. Sometimes it simply happens. Beckett's world is full of such happenings, events without clear causes or lessons. The challenge is not to extract meaning from them, but to continue in their wake. This challenges instrumental models of creativity that treat failure as data to be optimised. While BMX certainly involves learning from mistakes, it also involves accepting that not all failures are instructive. Some attempts simply do not work. Beckett would insist that this does not invalidate the attempt. Value is not conditional upon usefulness. The act matters even when it teaches nothing explicit. Over time, the Beckettian rider develops a particular posture towards failure. It is neither heroic nor defeatist, it is dry, pragmatic and almost understated. Attempts are made, some fail, the body registers the outcome, another attempt follows. There is no narrative climax. This posture resists the cultural pressure to constantly justify oneself. One does not need to explain why one continues, one just continues. In this sense, BMX becomes a practice of what might be called creative endurance. Not endurance in the athletic sense of pushing through pain, but endurance as a capacity to remain present within uncertainty. Beckett's writing trains readers in this capacity. It asks them to stay with texts that refuse resolution, to read without the promise of payoff. BMX asks riders to stay with tricks that refuse to be landed, to persist with assurance. Failure, then, is not merely tolerated, it is inhabited. Risk is not sensationalised, it is normalised. Creative emergence does not arrive as inspiration, it seeps in through repetition. Beckett gives us a language for understanding this without romanticising it. He strips creativity of its glamour and reveals its true texture, stubborn, fragile and quietly relentless. To read Beckett alongside BMX is to recognise that both are practices of honest effort in the absence of guarantees. They do not offer redemption narratives, they do not promise mastery. They ask only this: can you remain within the difficulty without turning away? In BMX, as in Beckett, creativity is what happens when the answer is yes, again and again, without fanfare.